Western Civ 2 lecture here on the early and mid 18th century. During the early and mid 18th century, Europe resisted revolutions. We've been looking at revolutions that are happening, and certainly there's changes that are going along the way here. But what we want to do today is particularly look at some of the institutions that responded to their circumstances, some of the countries that respond to their circumstances in various ways, and the leadership, how they responded, and how government was shaped during that time period. This period that we're particularly focused on from 715 up until the last quarter of the 18th century is a time where many people focus on what they call enlightened absolutism. Certainly in Europe at this point in time, monarchical government continues to be the norm. But as these monarchs that rule during this time are somewhat informed by the ideas of the philosophers, they make changes in response to their circumstances. They're not all going to accept the idea of the social contract that Locke had initiated and that Rousseau had further developed, but they're going to make changes in response to circumstances which are based upon reason, and what we're going to find is these countries will sometimes go to battle against each other and seek to enlarge their power, and some of this will come at the expense of some institutions and certainly the population of the countries. As we think about enlightened absolutism, we're going to sweep across Europe, and we focus particularly on England and France up to this point in time, and they can fit within this also. Even early on here, we've seen that there's a certain pragmatism that we saw amongst the English monarchs, and that will continue on as we find that they're going to move to having the Hanoverians as their rulers. They're going to act in ways which will benefit them, and their perception is that it will benefit their countries. The same will happen in these other territories that we're going to look at. So let's just move territorially here to pick up with some of these different countries that we've been looking at. First of all, then, let's look up in the north part of Europe to Prussia. Prussia has really not been a major force up until after the time period of the 30 Years' War, which ended in 1648. At that point in time, we have the state of Brandenburg, which is around the modern-day capital city of Berlin, and the family that ruled there, the Hohenzollerns, are going to extend their territory to rule over small territories that are scattered around them. As we look at these Hohenzollerns, what we find is that they're ostensibly Lutheran, because this is the religion of the majority of the people in the area, but as they extend their territories, they're going to extend into territories where you have other religious groups that are represented, like Catholics, and what we're going to find is that from early on, these Hohenzollerns are going to be fairly latitudinarian. They're going to be tolerant religiously. This is an idea of enlightened absolutism, would be that religiously you wouldn't constrain the consciences of people. And so what we're going to find is that these Hohenzollerns are going to be particularly focused on using the church to promote loyalty and service to the monarch. The idea of divine kings would be something that they would not espouse publicly, but they certainly use the church to promote their subjects' loyalty. But as we move into the 18th century, Frederick William I builds monarchical power in a dramatic way, and he's going to rule from 1713 up until 1740. He's going to take this territory, which had been actually about one of the smaller political forces in Europe, and make it a major political force and the most domineering army at times in European history. So what Frederick William I is going to do is he's going to conscript peasants into the army and build his army. This will come at great expense. Like others before him, he's going to be somewhat latitudinarian. So as long as you're a Christian or claim Christianity, you're going to be welcome within this territory. During Frederick William's reign, he's also going to be enlightened insofar as he's going to promote elementary education amongst people. He sees this as being beneficial, that people can read and write and do arithmetic and be religiously informed. So in his educational curriculum, you have the 4 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic, and religion. These are things that are going to bring this territory together and promote well-being. He is not going to be a terribly flamboyant character who likes all the things of the arts and provide all the patronage that we'll see some other people do. Frederick II, who takes his place when he dies, is going to rule from 1740 until 1786. In response to his father's rather oppressive regime, we'll find that he will continue to be a very tolerant person, but he's going to be even less obviously Christian along the way. And what we're going to see in Frederick II here is an example of enlightened absolutism. He's going to take a state that commanded the loyalty of the military, with its leaders being driven by the nobility. Again, in Germany, these are known as the Junkers. He's going to take advantage of the Lutheran clergy and a growing bureaucracy that's recruited from an educated middle class, and he's going to use this to build his power. Now, Frederick himself embodies something of this idea of the Enlightenment in that he declares himself to be the first servant of the state. He's going to require nobles who desired positions in his bureaucracy to qualify by merit. So, you have to be able to read, and you have to write, and you have to prove that you can do these things. You have to establish a track record. It's not just that you're going to get them because of whose child you may be. Now, that may help along the way, but he's looking to have people who gain positions because of merit rather than because of position that comes with birth. And he's going to establish a Prussian civil service agency that oversees education, and the examinations that come out of this education system will be required for government appointments, and this is going to change who all serves in the Prussian state. Now, Frederick will appoint some nobles during his reign, but those who did will gain that position based upon merit and not just based upon blood. Along the way, he's very pragmatic in that he keeps the Prussian nobility satisfied by protecting their social interests and maintains their dominance of the military leadership. Within his territory there in Prussia, he's going to, when it comes to religious toleration that I alluded to earlier, he'll allow Catholics and Jews to settle there. This will be something that later on people like Hitler aren't going to particularly appreciate, as there's going to be some Jewish immigration into Germany. But as he's going to expand his territory, as he's going to take advantage of the question in Austrian succession, whether or not a princess can take the throne, he's going to seize the territory of Silesia towards the south, and in that territory, which is made up largely of Catholics, he'll protect their freedom of religion after he conquers that province from the Habsburgs of Austria. His religious toleration is seen, the breadth of that is seen in the fact that allegedly he's reported as saying that he'd be willing to build mosques for Turks if they would choose to move into his country. He's going to be supported by philosophers like Immanuel Kant. Within his territories, we're going to find that he's going to order a new organization of Prussian law. What he wants to do is to rationalize the existing legal system in order to make it more efficient, to get rid of those differences that appeared in different regions. He wants to abolish torture and limit the number of capital crimes. All these things are seen to be the actions of a enlightened person, but he is not going to have a whole lot of protection of individual freedoms. There will be great prosperity and growth as he's going to encourage workers from outside Prussia to immigrate into Prussia. He'll promote improved agriculture and promote the use of new crops like those potatoes that come from the New World. And so there is going to be societal economic growth, and that's going to help him to afford the large armies that he's going to want to have in order to dominate and enlarge his territory, particularly as he goes to take territory away from the Habsburgs and others who are his neighbors. So the Prussians are going to grow in power, and he's going to make political choices along the way, which sometimes mean that he shifts alliances. And he's going to be willing to use war as an instrument of his designs. As he looks towards where all he wants to go, he's willing to use war. So he's not just a person who loves peace, and he's such an enlightened person that he's not going to use violence to accomplish his ends along the way. So this is up in Northern Europe. As we move towards Southern Europe, we come to the Empire of the Habsburgs, with their central location of their base being in Austria. And there in Austria, their power had certainly been built at earlier times, back in the 17th century, by people like Leopold I, who had expanded their territory eastward. That had continued on over the time period of the 17th century, where they had taken territory away from the Ottoman Turks and had gained territories like Hungary, Croatia, Slovenia, moving over towards the Black Sea. So they had already been a growing empire towards the east. They had lost some territories over in the west, in the Netherlands, and they're going to lose more territory in the west, but they're a large territory here in southeastern Europe. Now, the family that's ruling, the Habsburgs, had dominated European politics for a long time, and yet when Maria Theresa came to power, the Prussians up to the north would take advantage of this by engaging in the War of Austrian Succession. Through their political maneuvering and their great armies, they're going to be able to seize the territory of Silesia. Okay, so this will take place, and if you're here in America and you're familiar with American history, this War of Austrian Succession will have its local ramifications here in the Americas in what's known as King George's War. And it'll take place from about 1744 until 1748. But back in Europe, the Austrians lose territory and population, but Maria Theresa comes to power, and she's going to rule for a very, very long time. Her heir will be Joseph II. And Maria Theresa has him serve as a co-ruler for a long time. For 15 years, from 1765 until 1780, he will serve as a co-regent with his mother. Subsequently then, he will take over and rule the region of Austria. And during his rule over Austria, what we're going to find is that he is a person who makes changes. Again, he's not going to compel people in the area of religion. He's going to try to maintain the centralized Habsburg authority. After the War of Austrian Succession, his mother, Maria Theresa, had worked very hard to maintain the power of the Habsburg monarchy, and she had certainly built a much larger bureaucracy, and it wasn't just larger, it was also more effective. She made a more effective way of collecting taxes, and that's going to cause some angst on the part of some individuals, but she's going to have money with which to build armies and to build central institutions. She's going to expand the availability of elementary education, and certainly she shows some concern for her subjects. While she doesn't particularly espouse the ideas of the Enlightenment, she is concerned for those who are her subjects, and she's going to want to maintain control, so she'll expand her power over the nobility in order to protect the peasants from their noble lords, and restrict the amount of labor, for example, that a noble could demand from someone who worked on the land as a serf. So Joseph II, when he comes to power, has some examples from his mother, Maria Theresa. And so he's going to want to extend his territory. This is what their perspective is that a good monarch would do. And he will do so at the expense of Poland and the Ottoman Empire. So he's going to look to extend his territory. And more than anything, however, he wants to exert more control over his traditional Habsburg dominations and to reduce the regional powers of their influence. Most particularly, he wanted to reduce the freedoms that the Hungarians had. He wanted to reorganize the government in Hungary in order to put people who were particularly loyal to him. Now, as far as church things go, Joseph II was a practicing Catholic, as were other members of his family, but he extended freedom of worship to Protestants and the Greek Orthodox within his territory. They would be permitted to build churches, allowed to operate their own schools. They could enter into various skilled trades and be permitted to hold academic appointments and public service positions. He wasn't quite as liberal with the Jews, but the Jews were allowed to immigrate into his territory, although they weren't granted equality. While he was a Catholic, he wanted to be able to have some influence over the Catholic Church, and so he's going to insist that bishops not go communicating directly with the Pope, that they should operate through the king. He will close a number of monasteries and confiscate lands and try to redistribute priests, because some areas which weren't quite so attractive had a shortage of priests. And he will work on developing seminaries where priests would be properly trained, and these seminaries were under Habsburg governmental supervision. But along the way, what we see happens is that the priests become employees of the state. In the area of economics, what we find is that he's going to, within this large multi-ethnic empire that he's inherited, he will abolish internal tariffs on trade. That will encourage movement of goods within his territory, and he's encouraged the construction of roads and systems by way they could float heavy products on rivers. So you've got the Danube River, for example, flowing through this territory. When it comes to things down on the farm, he's very interested in agrarian reform and makes some personal inspections of farms. Like his mother, he's concerned about the position of the serfs, but he's not going to totally abolish the authority of landlords over peasants. But he looks to moderate their authority, and what he will grant within the Austrian Empire is that peasants have the right to marry. They don't have to ask their lord if they can marry, and to have children, and to have an education. So he's trying to reduce some of the limitations on peasants And this is largely in order to make them more effective and productive, whether it's on the farm or in some other area of endeavor. The Austrians are an empire that's going to be able to continue, but it is an empire that's going to be something on the wane, because the only access it has to the sea is along the Adriatic, the area we know today as the where Yugoslavia recently was, where you have Slovakia and not Slovakia, Slovenia and Croatia, and these territories there, that along the northeastern coast of the Adriatic, this would be their way to the sea. But they don't really have an empire elsewhere around the world. They're not really gaining empire, and this is going to be some of the way in which they're going to be eclipsed by other political groups in this time period. If we move to the north, the next country that's underway, that's existing here, that's a major player, would be that of Russia. As we began the semester, we saw that Ivan the Terrible had expanded Russian territory eastward, all the way into what we know as Siberia, and he was a rather ruthless individual. But after his dynasty had come to an end, there was a time of troubles, lots of unrest, until the Romanov dynasty is established. And Peter Romanov is going to make dramatic changes as he rules from 1689 up until 1725. He's going to promote a great deal of modernization, and particularly westernization. Some of that was not well received. Some of that was highly resisted, as he wants to change the way that the nobles dress. In Russia, you might expect that wearing a beard would be comfortable in the cold winters, but he's going to insist that they need to move towards not having those big, long, flowing beards, that they ought to be clean-shaven. That instead of having those long-tailed coats to keep themselves warm in the winter, that they would have the short coats of others. Some people would make religious objections to this, where they'd say, "Hey, you're destroying the image of God in me if you're insisting that I cut away my beard." But through his long reign, he's able to effect changes, and he's going to move away from some of the old power centers. So he'll move the capital away from Moscow to St. Petersburg along the Baltic Sea, and build new infrastructure there. Like those who'd gone before him, he's going to be something of a Caesaro-papist. And yet while the Romanov dynasty is going to be established here, what we'll find is that there's a number of successors of Peter Romanov who die as a result of assassination. Now, the Romanov family stays in power, but they are going to be oftentimes bumped off by their palace guard, which is made up of people from the nobility. So if we jump over a few years here in a number of successions, what we'll find is that Peter III was the Romanov Tsar of Russia, who was succeeded by his wife, Catherine. Catherine was a German princess who actually may be implicated in his assassination. But as he died, she became empress, and she's going to have a great deal of influence in the development of the government at this time period in Russia. She's a person who is widely read, and we'll find that she is going to have lots of good political connections with Russia's leading nobles. But she will also invite individuals to come into her court and be informed about what all is going on, ideas that emerge in the West. And what we'll see is that she will have some enlightened policies along the way. She does believe that she wants to expand her empire. She wants to do that against the Ottoman Turks. But what we'll find is that eventually, here in the middle of her reign, she'll decide that she can come to make a peace treaty with Ottoman Turks. And what they do as a reward is they make her the protector of the Orthodox Christians within their territory. This is going to mean that the Russians have an interest in certain churches that will be in the Holy Land, for example. some ways that she's seen to be an enlightened despot here is that she makes some administrative reforms within Russia. She's going to support local nobles, but at the same time, while she gives privileges to the nobility in a great charter established in 1785, she's going to want to maintain control over this empire. She doesn't want to divide up her power. But she's going to gain loyalty in the process. She needed these nobles to serve her purposes of maintaining control over this large empire. She is going to be successful in promoting economic growth. Part of that is going to come along because she's going to remove internal trade barriers. So within her territories, there's not taxes, and when you move from one noble's territory to another, and that's going to make for greater movement of goods and services. It's going to be less expensive to import things if they pass through several different barriers on the way to get to you. She's also going to find that she has some things that are desired by the rest of the Europeans, particularly naval supplies. Coming from Russia here, there's going to be timber and tar and other commodities that constitute naval supplies that she's going to have available to her that she can export. There's also going to be some food that she's able to export. Russia, however, wants to gain territory, and this is certainly one of her aspirations. One of their aspirations is to gain a warm water port. You may have ports in the Baltic, but they freeze over in the winter. So she's particularly concerned about moving to the south, and she does so against the Ottomans in the early part of her reign, whereby she's going to gain a warm water port on the Black Sea. These will be ports that don't freeze over. As we move into the area today of Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula. So Russia is going to win several victories that give her control of Ottoman provinces on the Danube River and the Crimean coast of the Black Sea. Eventually, this will lead in a peace treaty between the Ottomans and the Russians, whereby the Russians gain control of the Black Sea. They have the right to navigate anywhere they wish in Ottoman waters. Most importantly, that's going to mean that they can come and go through the Bosphorus. Right there by Istanbul, they can come through there anytime they want. And they have the right to protect Orthodox Christians living within the Ottoman Empire. So, under Catherine the Great, she's going to acquire new territories to the south, and then she's going to have a peace treaty. She's also going to expand to the west, particularly in taking parts of Poland. During her reign, she and the Prussians both had aspirations to take territory that had been controlled by Poland. And so Frederick the Great of Prussia made a proposal to Russia and to Austria that basically they'd each take a piece of Poland. So, under Frederick's plan, Russia agreed to abandon the conquered territories they had in the Danube, and in return would receive a large chunk of Poland. Because Prussia had agreed to remain neutral, it's going to get territories between East Prussia and the rest of Prussia, so it'll have a contiguous territory. Austria, meanwhile, will take control of southern Poland, an area known as Galicia, where they will gain access to some important salt mines. So Poland is vulnerable here because the local nobles had not worked to create a unified central government, and as a result they were vulnerable to these large European powers of Austria and Russia and Prussia. In France, what we find is that the practice of having a monarch, a king, continued after Louis XIV. As he came to the end of his reign, he had fought a long war, the War of the Spanish Succession. Here in America, the local face of that would be what we know as Queen Anne's War. For us living here in Elizabeth City, this had implications locally here as we think about a time period of great unrest and piracy and all that would result along the North Carolina coast. But following Queen Anne's War, or the War of Spanish Succession, Louis XIV had died in 1715, and as a result, his grandson came to power. He'll take the title Louis XV, and he's going to reign for a long time. During his long reign, we're going to find he's a child for the first part of that, and so there'll be Lord's protector looking after his interests. But Louis XV is never a terribly enlightened monarch who responds to circumstances. He's certainly entertained by the philosophes in the salons of France and in the palaces where he's at. But he's going to resist changes in France, and what we're going to find is that there will be an ongoing conflict. Again, there's long been a conflict going on between the English and the French, and it will continue to go on during this time period in the middle part of the 18th century. The first part of that is seen in the War of the Austrian Succession in the 1740s, where here in America we would know that as King George's War, but the French and the English are at odds with each other there. That won't be resolved. And so as a result, shortly thereafter in 1754, we'll have a war that goes until 1763. So if you do the math, this is what is known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, what we know in American history as the French and Indian War. This is a international war, but it's a war where the English and the French are fighting, and it's largely over issues that have to do with empire. And so this war is going to take place not just in Europe, but in North America, in New France, what we'll come to know as Canada as a result, as the English are going to win over this territory. Then there will be struggles that take place in Asia, various colonies there, and in islands in the Caribbean as well. So it's a war that has many fronts that are scattered around the world, and where the English kings and the French kings are at odds with each other. Louis XV certainly has opportunity to learn from the philosophes, but in his aspirations to build France and maintain empire, he's not really made concessions which might have given him a greater hold over his throne. He's not going to make a whole lot of concessions to the changes that his grandfather made. As far as religious toleration goes, Louis XIV had revoked the Edict of Nantes with what was known as the Edict of Fontainebleau, and under that he had basically said that, hey, if you're a Protestant clergyman, you need to immigrate, and you need to do that quickly. But the members of your flock, the members of your local church, they can't immigrate, they have to convert. So there's great challenges that exist for people. There's going to be a lot that's going to be sacrificed if they leave. They can't take anything with them, and so this is going to cause a great deal of tension in the areas of religion there in France, and there will be people who do succeed in immigrating, but if they try to do so and they're caught, again, they're going to be essentially enslaved for their effort at trying to escape to find freedom. He's certainly not going to want them to go into his colonies like Canada, so they don't allow religious dissidents to go into the colonies. They're trying to maintain that as a purely Catholic territory. And so he's going to follow something of Louis XIV's idea of, I am the state, and the state is me, and in my state there's one law, that's what I say, and there's one faith, and that's what I believe. So this will continue on in France under Louis XV, and here in the Americas, what we're going to find this time period is that people are going to be loyal to the British Crown because they're perceived as having helped them, particularly in fighting against intrusions by Indian tribes that had been subverted by the French. And at the end of this, when we get to 1763, we're going to find that the colonists have different agendas from the people back in England, particularly, for example, when the English agreed to a demarcation line, the so-called Proclamation Line of 1763, which is going to restrict the British colonies from expanding across the Appalachian Mountains to the west into Indian territory. And when they want to do that, then that's going to be something where the colonists and the mother country back in England are going to be at odds with each other, and it's going to lead to political unrest and unhappiness, amongst other causes of the American Revolution that we get to talk about the next time. Since we're talking about the English year, we need to bring you up to date with the English year during this time period. What we had left off with was that the English Parliament chose William and Mary to be the successors, and so we have this Hanoverian line where William and Mary rule, and they'll be succeeded by Queen Anne. But the problem is Queen Anne doesn't have any heirs, and so they end up looking for who's going to be the next ruler, and Parliament chooses a monarch who comes from over in Germany. And so we have the beginnings of the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha that's going to come to the throne. So we know them better as the Georgians. The first three monarchs are going to be Georges. Interestingly, George the First and George the Second, neither one speak English, but they work through translators, and they hold the position of power, but as monarch, but Parliament is basically operating under effective leadership of people like William Pitt. And as long as that continues on and people are prospering and the economy is growing in England, people are pretty well content with the way things are. But times are changing. Certainly the British economic power is growing, their empire is growing, and this is bringing prosperity to them. But politically, there haven't been a whole lot of changes. There's a lot of corruption that exists in England. The idea that you have a social contract and that you might have participation of government has been something that's been resisted, and it will continue to be resisted as we go on. What will happen is that they'll make incremental change and thereby avoid revolutions in England. In England at this point in time, you have a parliament. They'd long had a parliament. The parliament meets regularly, and you have individuals who represent various urban centers or counties. Traditionally, you've had 2 representatives from each county that are chosen. But with demographic shifts, some of these counties didn't really have that large a population, and you had new cities which have been developing with all this new food that's come from the different parts of the world, particularly from the New World. Population growth has been forging ahead here in England, and there's whole cities that don't have representation in Parliament. They've not been good about redistricting things to go have a census and reallocate representation. In the English system, the way that you typically have the right to make a contribution towards choosing your representative in Parliament would be based upon the fact that you are a tax-paying landowner. If you don't own a sufficient amount of land that you pay a minimal number of taxes, then you don't get to make a choice in this. And then there's some territories, some counties, where the major landholders are just politically domineering. They control so much land and they have so much influence that some of these things come to be known as pocket boroughs. That would be places from which there's representatives chosen for the Parliament that are in the pocket of certain great landlords who come from the old nobility. So the English political system is not one where there's great representation, where you have a real ability to participate in government. Certainly it was different from what went on in France, and philosophers that visited England, like Voltaire and others, were inspired by what they saw in the constitutional government of England and the limited monarchy that existed there. But there's still not widespread enfranchisement, people having the right to vote. Very few people get the right to vote, and it's suggested that perhaps maybe 1,000 people were able to control Parliament. So it's not a terribly representative system that existed at this point in time, but it was one where there's more participation and representation than existed in some of these other countries of the time period. As we move from the area of politics and all, looking towards society, again, our textbook has spent a great deal of time dealing with society here in the middle part of the 18th century. What we find is that there wasn't seen to be a whole lot of dramatic change. It's not going to be the dramatic change that happens as we move into the early 19th century. But society was nonetheless changing in significant ways with the increasing of population and the movement of populations towards urban centers. Generally, things were looking to be getting better. There were some negative things, however, that certainly emerged and were jarring to people's sensitivities. As we move towards the middle of the century, around 1750, what we find is that climatic fluctuation is certainly in evidence, as we have something of a emergent ice age where things get colder for a while, and this is going to have an impact on crop yields and population growth. But perhaps the most jarring thing was the 1755 earthquake that took place out in the Atlantic Ocean about 200 miles off the Iberian Peninsula, where this fault that happens between Europe as it comes against Africa, goes through the Straits of Gibraltar and extends out into the Atlantic. There was a earthquake that took place there that was on high order of magnitude, probably about a 9 on the Richter scale, which caused a tsunami that devastated coastlines. The tsunami certainly had waves that would reach across the Atlantic, even here to the Outer Banks, but nothing like the size of those which would sweep up the river valleys of the ports in places like Portugal. Lisbon is particularly devastated by this disaster, where in the earthquake and the collapses that took place, and then in subsequent fires that were ignited and got started there, perhaps as many as 100,000 people died in that earthquake. And this would be something that people like Voltaire would write about, questioning God's goodness. So there are some cataclysmic events that take place along the way, but generally population is growing, business is growing, people are continuing to operate in ways that they've known before, and the way that business is largely conducted still happens to be in private workshops, where people are able to own instruments of production. There are machines increasingly being used. They've long used certain kinds of machines in production, but most of these areas where there's machines that are used are driven by people power or animal power, and they're relatively small scale sorts of things that individuals might own. There is money to be had and to be invested. And this is one of the things that's helping England to grow particularly, is that there's something of a stable economy, a growing economy, where there's fairly low interest rates for borrowing money, and people are pretty certain that they're going to get paid back. And as a result, the interest rates are low, and this helps to promote investment in entrepreneurial endeavors. But as I said, most people work on machines that they can own individually and they can operate within their home. You don't have to go off to work, you just work within your home. And so, for example, if you take wool, you might spin it into thread. And then you might also have another, and so you can do that by hand, but what's going to develop is that they have developed the spinning wheel. And so it's a relatively simple machine with a few metal parts that go together with the wooden pieces, and you can operate this in your living space of your home. A slightly bigger piece of equipment would be a loom, in which you would weave textiles. This is an old piece of technology in some ways, but they're going to see some improvements that are going to speed up production. And as this production speeds up, this is going to mean that those people who have that kind of technology have an advantage over people who are doing it in the old way. So when we'll talk about this more with the Industrial Revolution and particularly the textile industry in Europe. But the way that they've been operating here is using these simple machines, and individuals own those and operate them within their home, and they do their part of the task. Now, sometimes there are people who are operating at a bigger scale, and so what they might do if they have a farm where there's sheep is that they might assign work, a bale of wool, for example, to a family which would turn it then into yarn, into thread. Somebody else then could weave it. Or if I have a bunch of thread that's been spun, well, then I could take that to somebody and assign that to them and ask them to make that into material that clothes could be made from. And this comes to be known as what is the putting out system. That is that you give people certain amounts of raw materials or goods that have been developed, and then they add to the value through their labor. And so whether it's in a spinning wheel or a loom, you could add value to the material that you have, and you basically contract to do this much work, this many pounds of wool will be turned into thread, and you're paid for what you do. There's not a great deal of concern about how fast that happens. The objective is that you get it done, and you get it done in an agreed upon amount of time. So if you work all night, that's fine, and you get it done quickly, or that you just get it done by the deadline. So individuals control their own lives. They work at their pace. They produce objects that they can then sell, and they reap the rewards for that. And so this is going to be the way that business is largely conducted at this point in time. So we still have people living on manors in England, working on these landed estates where they may pay rents to the great landowners, and they're able to get the benefit of the crops that they produce. People in urban settings are able to take raw materials and turn them into manufactured goods that people want, and something that develops that's important for the economy here at this point in time is the idea of promissory notes, where you don't necessarily have to transfer specie, that would be pieces of precious metal. They're still going to prefer precious metal, whether they're guineas, gold coins in England, or silver coins, or copper coins. Those coins are seen to have value in the metal in them alone. But what they're going to move eventually towards is paper currency. And this paper currency represents a certain amount of the precious metals that somebody is going to guarantee that you can come and acquire for giving them their promissory note. That way you're not having to move around the precious metals. Precious metals will continue to be valuable in exchange for a long time. But being able to use paper money is going to promote economic movement, particularly when banks are developing. Banks are continuing to develop, and as they can issue paper money, then they can hold the gold and silver that is behind the economic expansion that's taking place at this point in time. But all of this is just waiting for a change, as we're going to find the coming of the Industrial Revolution, and some of the inventions and ideas that come along here in the middle part of the 18th century are going to have lasting ramifications and impact on society. We'll talk about those in conjunction with the Industrial Revolution that we'll be talking about coming up here. I thank you for your attention today.